Welcome at Palazzo Vettori. The lecture series at Palazzo Vettori is the first one of this semester, and I'm proud and honored to have here tonight Professor Riccardo Bruscagli. Uh, Riccardo has been professor of Italian literature at the University of Florence for many years. He's one of the most esteemed professionals in the field, and he has extensively published on every possible author of the Italian literature, comparative literature. He's an expert of many fields, one of which is surely Niccolò Machiavelli. And tonight, he will give us a lecture about Niccolò Machiavelli. Riccardo Bruscagli. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. And it's always exciting to speak to a new audience, especially young, beautiful people. So there is a title to my speech this evening, Machiavelli and Beyond. So why beyond Machiavelli? Because in order to understand Machiavelli, we must go beyond him, beyond his time. And we must explore, this is my opinion, who he has become in the general opinion of common people, what his posthumous fortune, or better to say, misfortune, has made of him. And it's a foggy landscape, and I wouldn't be surprised if most of you find yourselves lost in that fog. Relax. It's not your fault. If you think that Machiavellian is a bad word, then Machiavelli is the epitome of political dishonesty and cynicism. If you are convinced that Machiavelli wrote the infamous sentence, "the end justifies the means," which he never wrote, it's not your fault. We are in the company of very illustrious people, in the company, for example, of the philosopher Bertrand Russell, who defined the masterpiece of Machiavelli, the little treatise entitled The Prince. He said, he defined the Prince, handbook for gangsters. Or in the company of the great Hollywood actor, Jazz Palminteri, who in the movie Bronx Tale, directed by Robert De Niro in 1993, quotes a sentence from The Prince, "It's better to be feared than loved," and if I remember well, even gives to his mafiosi followers a copy of The Prince himself. But the fog that surrounds the historical figure of Niccolò Machiavelli and still disfigures, I think, and distorts his thought is not a contemporary one. It's a very ancient, and in fact starting just after the death of Machiavelli in 1527. And actually, let's go back exactly to this date, 1527, to focus on one of the first and very seminal vilifications of our poor Niccolò Machiavelli. We are in England, we are in London, at the court of Henry VIII, you know, the one who had this passion of decapitating his wives. And at the court of the Tudors in 1527, the inflammatory question of the day was the king's divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, whom he did not decapitate, he only divorced her. And the discussion was about the legitimacy of his union with Anne Boleyn, Anna Bolena in Italian, whom he actually would have, as you remember, in time decapitated. The scene I'm referring to is described in a Latin work entitled Apologia, Apology, written by Reginald Pole. Who was Reginald Pole? Pole was at the time a very influential presence at the court of Henry VIII. He was a cousin of the king, a young, very erudite prelate, educated in Italy at the University of Padua. And in his work, this Apologia, written in 1539, he reports his dialogue with Sir Thomas Cromwell, the powerful prime minister of the king. The subject of the conversation is quite predictably the imminent divorce of the king and the opinion of Reginald about the whole affair. Reginald Pole, who in the following years sided firmly with the Catholics against the king and his separation from the Church of Rome, for the time being in this dialogue, it seems to me that he doesn't want to compromise himself. He says platitudes. He says that in every circumstance, a courtier should advise his lord with good words, inspired by the principles of the Christian law and of the right morality. And Cromwell disagrees. You scholars, he says, you intellectuals, you live in the dream of ideal politics. I instead had recently in my hands a little book which teaches the principle of real, practical politics. And that book in England in that date was Machiavelli's Prince. Now, Reginald Pole, who was, as I said, a scholar and an intellectual and a devoted reader, searched for that book that he didn't know, got it, read it, and he was the first who famously reacted in horror to that reading. So this is his reaction, the first episode of what we can call anti-Machiavellism. A gut revulsion to a book that Reginald Pole judged, the Apologia is in Latin, as I said, judged scriptum ab hoste humani generis, that is, written by an enemy of the human race, of humanity. A book, Satane digito scriptum, written by the finger of Satan, by the finger of the devil. It's the beginning of what we can call the Catholic anti-Machiavellism. And Reginald Pole, as I said, opposed to the religious politics of the king, returned to Italy, became a powerful cardinal in the Roman Church, and in 1555, but for a handful of votes, did not become pope. But not that the Protestants treated Machiavelli any better. On the contrary, in the Elizabethan theater, during the time of the reign of Elizabeth, Machiavelli is frequently quoted or alluded to as a treacherous counselor, a schemer who manipulates others, and even a usurer, a pimp, and an assassin. Only one quotation, which is also the most famous. In William Shakespeare's Henry VI, we encounter Richard of Gloucester, the character who will become the protagonist of another more famous historical drama of Shakespeare, Richard III. Remember, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. But here, in Henry VI, Richard is not the king of England yet. Actually, he seems quite far removed from the possibility of grabbing the crown. He's a hunchback, he's ugly, he's unpopular, and not so high in the line of succession to the throne. But he is fiercely determined to arrive there. And here is his famous monologue where he boasts about the qualities, or better to say the vices, which will help his way to power. I hope you appreciate my Shakespearean diction. Why I can smile and murder while I smile, and cry content to that which grieves my heart, and wet my cheeks with artificial tears, and frame my face to all occasions. I'll drown more sailors than the mermaid shall. I'll slay more gazers than the basilisk. I can add colors to the chameleon, change shapes with Proteus for advantages, and set the murderous Machiavel to school. Can I do this and cannot get a crown? Murderous Machiavel. So Machiavelli is quoted here as a typical assassin. even though Richard thinks that this Italian murderer is a schoolboy in the art of assassination compared to him. But this is just a minimal taste of the vast literature which makes the phenomenon of Machiavellism, or better to say, anti-Machiavellism. Something which is, mind you, which is very interesting per se, historically, ideologically, philosophically, but it's not Machiavelli. Machiavellism or anti-Machiavellism, very interesting, but it's not Machiavelli. And yet, the question is it possible that there was something in Machiavelli's thought, in the writing of The Prince, that triggered such rabid reactions? Why so much revulsion, so much hatred? What was so scandalous in this slim booklet to become the obsession of Catholics as well as Protestants, and to be quoted even today like a very dangerous work? Is it just a question of a colossal misunderstanding? So let's see. Machiavelli wrote The Prince in 1513, not far from here, near San Casciano in the countryside, where he owned a small parcel of land and a few houses. Sant'Andrea in Percusina is the precise name of the place, and if you want, you can visit it. It takes half an hour by bus from Florence. Have you been there? Yeah, no, you will. You'll eat well, by the way. The Prince was written there under sad circumstances. Machiavelli had been the secretary of the Florentine Republic, of the second chancery of the Republic, to be exact, for 15 years. He entered office in 1498, aged 29. He lived through the years of the most, let's say, democratic regime in Florence. Riccardelli, just don't. I'm simplifying, I know, okay? The most democratic regime in Florence, because after the death of Lorenzo il Magnifico in 1492, the Medici had been forced out of Florence, and the city had experimented the most pure, let's say, republican government. And Machiavelli had been at the center of it. No surprise that when the Medici came back to town in 1513, in a typical twist of Renaissance spoils system, he lost his job. And mind you, the Medici were not the former lords of Florence, not yet. The city was still formally a republic, but in fact the Medici family ruled the city, and everything was done according to their volition. So here is Niccolò Machiavelli in 1513, fallen from grace, jobless, confined in the rustic village of Sant'Andrea, after many long exciting years mingling with the popes and kings, emperors, powerful politicians, ambassadors, and so on. It is in this situation of extreme frustration that Machiavelli wrote The Prince, and he wrote it under two different pressures, I think. First of all, pressured by a theoretical intention. Writing to a friend, he declared that in his Prince he meant to demonstrate, quote, what a principality is, what kinds there are, how they are acquired, how they are maintained, why they are lost. But in the same letter, he manifested also a second, more practical scope of his writing. He wanted to offer the little treatise to some member of the Medici family in order to demonstrate the excellence and know-how of his political experience and to be readmitted to the magic world of politics that he missed so much. In the letter, he says, "There is my desire that these lords, these Medici, should begin to engage my services, even they should start out by having me roll a stone. Just, employ me. I'm ready to do anything that you can devise." So the Prince came out from an intellectual impulse as a treatise to how to rule, and a practical one. Employ me. Use me in whatever manner you think appropriate, because I breathe and live only in politics. And that's why a witty American scholar once defined the Prince the most famous job application in history. The Prince is a small book composed of 26 chapters. It deals with various matters, institutional, military, economic, but its core, the chapters which scandalize people like Reginald Pole or Shakespeare, are the central ones from chapter 15 to chapter 18. Here, Machiavelli deals with the behavior of the prince, with his virtues or vices. It was a very well-known matter, very familiar to the political literature from antiquity to the humanism. Actually, in the decades preceding Machiavelli, such literature specialized in a particular genre that has been deemed specula principis, mirrors of princes. That is, the writer, more than often a very flattering courtier, shows to his prince a mirror that is an idealized specimen of an ideal prince, saying, you see, you should look like this. And I don't have to tell you that most of the time the writer, this writer's courtier adds, but what am I doing? You, my lord, don't need to be confronted with this image because you are already the ideal prince incarnated. Machiavelli destroys all of this. First of all, he's not interested in the real virtues or vices of his prince. He's not interested in what the prince is, but in what the prince appears to be. All the titles of the chapters of the prince are in Latin, and the title of chapter 15 reads, I'll give you some Italian here and there and even some Latin, I hope you don't mind. This is the original Latin of this title. De his rebus quibus nomine et homines et praesertim principes laudantur aut vituperantur. What men and particularly rulers are praised and blamed for. Notice please this passive. In Latin, laudantur, vituperantur. In English, are praised and blamed. We won't deal here with the real morality of the prince, but with his image, with the way he wants to be looked at, to be judged, to be considered. Is the prince seen from the outside by the eyes of the public? And this is a huge leap. Machiavelli is here not to teach the prince how to be, let's say, generous, benign, loyal, but how to be judged as such. And Machiavelli knows perfectly that he's detaching himself here from a huge tradition of idealized intellectual construction of an idealized politics. And this is what he says. Given that a great deal has already been written about this, I fear people may find my contribution presumptuous, especially since here, more than elsewhere, the code of conduct I'm offering will be rather controversial, which is, I follow the translation of Tim Parks, but here I think it's a kind of a weak translation. The Italian goes, partendomi nel disputare questa materia dagli ordini degli altri. I'm departing from all the ways and procedures that the others have followed. But since my aim was to write something useful for anyone interested, I felt it would be appropriate to go to the real truth of the matter, verità effettuale della cosa, not to repeat other people's fantasies. Many writers have dreamed up republics and kingdoms that bear no resemblance to experience and never existed in reality. Who are these others from whose conduct and thoughts he wants to depart? To what ordini degli altri, to what imaginary republics and states is he referring? Well, more or less to the whole tradition of Western political thought, from Plato's Republic to Aristotle's Politics, to the Summa Theologica of St. Thomas, to the Specula Principis, to the Mirrors of Princes that I have already mentioned. Such divergence in the three fundamental chapters that follow is expressed in very simple terms. These are the chapters that I would call the chapters of the non di manco, of the nonetheless, of the however, of the all the same, of the but, since they are constructed structurally in the same way. We are dealing here with the three of the numerous virtues required in a prince: liberalità, generosity; pietà, compassion; and fede, loyalty. And their opposed qualities, stinginess, cruelty, disloyalty. And each chapter starts recognizing the obvious. The obvious. That's why they are so symmetrical. That is the opportunity of the positive virtue discussed in the chapter. For example, chapter 16, de liberalitate et parsimonia, e sarebbe bene essere tenuto liberale, non di manco la liberalità usata in modo che tu sia tenuto ti offende. That is, generosity and stinginess. We can say that it would be nice to be seen as generous. All the same, being generous just to be seen to be so will damage you. 17. De crudelitate et pietate, et anzi il melius amari quanti meri vele contra. Ciascuno principe debbe desiderare di essere tenuto pietoso e non crudele, non di manco debbe avvertire di non usare male questa pietà. That is, cruelty and compassion, whether it's better to be feared or loved. I'm sure every leader would wish to be seen as compassionate rather than cruel. All the same, he must be careful not to use his compassion unwisely. And finally, 18. Quomodo fides a principibus sit servanta. Quando sia laudabile in uno principe il mantenere la fede e vivere con integrità e con astuzia, ciascuno lo intende, non di manco. Which translates, everyone will appreciate how admirable it is for a ruler to keep his word and to be honest than deceitful. However, in our own times, we have had examples of leaders who have done great things without worrying too much about keeping their word. The all the same, the however, the non di manco in Italian is the hinge that inverts the terms of the debate. Machiavelli does not intend to subvert the traditional values. He is not a libertine. So at the beginning of these chapters, as I said, he states the obvious, because it's obvious that the prince should be generous, should be compassionate, should be loyal. But, however, non di manco, in the real world, in the world of the verità effettuale, of the real truth of the matter, the prince must be ready to be miserly, cruel, treacherous. And this is the crucial point. Machiavelli never absolved the prince from the vices that, according to him, sometimes a ruler is obliged to practice. Nowhere does he ever say that for the superior interest of the state, an evil action of a prince is justified. It is not justified. It is necessary, which is very different. I quote, what you have to understand is that a ruler can't always behave in ways that would make people think a man good, because to stay in power is frequently obliged to act against loyalty, against charity, against humanity, and against religion. What matters is that he has the sort of character that can change tack as luck and circumstances demand. And as I've already said, stick to the good if he can, but know how to be bad when the occasion demands. And in the beautiful Italian of Machiavelli, non partirsi dal bene potendo, ma sapere entrare nel male necessitato. Ma sapere entrare nel male. Male is male, evil is evil, and remains evil and not justified. Però there is something more regarding especially the chapter 17 and chapter 18. Let's start with the 17. Remember the title, Cruelty and Compassion, whether it is better to be feared or loved. But the Latin goes, de crudelitate and et pietate, cruelty and compassion. Now, I don't want to be too subtle here, but I'm convinced that Machiavelli here is censoring his vocabulary. What do I mean? I mean that Machiavelli could not ignore that in all the political tradition, the political lexicon that precedes him, the opposite of crudelitas, the opposite of cruelty, is not pietas, is not pietà, compassion, but is clementia, clemency. And he could not ignore that clementia, if he had used this word, that would have excited a much more immediate revulsion in his readers. Seneca wrote a whole treatise entitled De Clementia, identifying in this virtue the typical virtue of the good prince, and in its opposite, crudelitas, cruelties, the typical vice of the tyrant. Seneca had been very clear. Clementia is the virtue which makes rulers closer to God, and it is the moral standard which defines the difference between prince and tyrant. Clementia efficit, some more Latin, ut magnum inter regem tyrannumque discrimen sit. It's clemency which makes the big difference between a prince and a tyrant. I hope I'm not over-analyzing, but it seems to me that the avoidance of the obvious word clementia must be more than a linguistic casualty in Machiavelli's Prince. It seems to me that he avoids the very word clementia because he knows very well that this is a word and a moral quality intrinsic to the good prince in all the political literature and political lexicon before him. And instead, what he's saying that his prince can disregard pietà, that is, clementia, and accept crudelitas. And this is not just a question of ancient writers like Seneca. Also in modern time, the specula principis insisted in the opposition between clementia crudelitas to distinguish on one side the rex, the princeps, the good ruler, and on the other side the tyrannus, the tyrant. In the books of writers like Pontano, Beroaldo, Platina, and the like, the opposition is clear-cut. I will limit myself here to quote from Platina's chapter, De Clementia Principis, on the clemency of prince, in his De Principe, in his treatise on the prince. But really, we are dealing here with a commonplace of this kind of literature. Platina wrote, Hic est quod clementes Deo similes existimamus, contravero crudeles et immites detestamur, et abominamur, ut inimicos et hostes humani generis. It is intrinsic to a prince to maintain people within the borders of their duties, not so much through severity and harshness, but through indulgence and mercy, with the help of mature consideration. That's why we judge the merciful resembling the gods. On the contrary, we detest the cruel and merciless and abominate them as enemies of humankind. Clementes similes Deo, crudeles inimicos et hostes humani generis. The fact that Machiavelli cautiously avoids a word clementia so ideologically charged and prefers a word much less significant and much less incriminating like pietà tells me that he knew that here he was doing something truly hazardous. Because here he abolishes the barrier between princeps and tyrannus, which between the good prince and the tyrant, which had been the fundament, the bastion of the political tradition before him. Here he's insinuating that a ruler, an acceptable ruler, his ruler, can be at the same time cruel and clement, that is, a prince and a tyrant. And this is further accentuated by the subordinate position that depends from the first one in chapter 17. Maybe you remember the title, Cruelty and Compassion, and then whether it's better to be feared or loved. Machiavelli says that there is a dispute about this, and in saying so, I think that he had in mind a famous scene from the tragedy Octavia, which was attributed in Machiavelli's time to Seneca. No surprise there. Here in this famous scene, two characters, Seneca himself and his disciple, Nero, the infamous emperor, engage in an exchange where the philosopher Seneca on one side preaches the virtues of being loved, and the tyrant on the other side rebukes, chanting the praises of being feared. And the exchange goes like this, just a little excerpt. Seneca, the true merit is to do what is morally decent, not what one can do. Nero, the populace steps on losers, and Seneca, and crushes the ones he hates. Nero, the sword is what secures the princes, and Seneca, rather loyalty, and Nero, it is becoming that Caesar is feared, and Seneca, rather than Caesar is loved, and Nero, people must be kept in fear. Once again, Machiavelli doesn't shy from attributing to his prince the abominable and very well-known qualities of the classic tyrant, of a negative, legendary figure like Nero. And in so doing, Machiavelli maybe didn't know, but he was also creating a new character, the character of a ruler divided within, conflicted, good and evil at the same time, ambiguous, therefore powerfully disturbing. I'm not the first to say that without Machiavelli, we wouldn't have Macbeth, a totally new type of power figure, tragically lacerated, inspiring at the same time sympathy and horror, revulsion and compassion. And I think that this is the basic idea which has made The Prince such a popular but also an intolerable book from the 16th century until now, because it's hard to accept the idea that politics must be tyrannical, that is evil sometimes, and with no redemption, no justification. One last thing, no justification. Machiavelli doesn't justify the necessary evil of politics. I insisted on this concept enough, I think. For him, to kill a man remains to kill a man. Sometimes necessary, never morally justified. But the chapter 18 of The Prince might explain why instead a proverb like "the end justifies the means" could arise from his pages. He never literally wrote that, but the chapter 18 deals with the fede, the fides, the loyalty of the princes. Quomodo fides a principibus sit servanda. And I repeat, I think, what I have already read. Quanto sia laudabile in uno principe il mantenere la fede e vivere con integrità e non con astuzia, ciascuno lo intende, non di manco. Everyone will appreciate how admirable it is for a ruler to keep his word and to be honest rather than deceitful. However, in our own time, as we have had example of leaders who have done great things without worrying too much about keeping their word. But from here, Machiavelli seems to jump on another subject because the text goes like this, continues like this. Bear in mind that there are two ways of doing battle, using the law and using force. Typically, humans use laws and animals force. But since playing by the law often proves inadequate, it makes sense to resort to force as well. Hence, a ruler must be able to exploit both the man and the beast in himself to the full. A un principe è necessario sapere bene usare la bestia e l'uomo. It's not a jump. There's not a disconnection here between the introduction about the faith, the loyalty of the prince, and this reasoning about the necessary bestial, let's say, part of the prince. There is instead a profound connection between the beginning of the chapter and its continuation. To contradict the fede, to be disloyal, sure, can be politically necessary. But what is the price? At what cost? At the cost of accepting to enter the kingdom of the beast, to become a monstrosity, half human, half beast. So sure, the prince must be ready to break his word, but the result is to become inhuman, to become literally a monster. And yet, this monster, which is the prince, need not worry about what his people think of him. We return at the first title of the cluster of the chapters that I've been dealing with. What men, and particularly rulers, are praised and blamed for. Laudantur aut vituperantur. I insisted on this passive form. Because the prince at this point might wonder, how will I be judged? What will the people, my subjects, think of me? What will be my public image? And Machiavelli is here to paradoxically reassure him. He says, in general, people judge more by appearances than first-hand experience, because everyone gets to see you, but hardly anyone deals with you directly. Everyone sees what you seem to be. Few have experience of who you really are. And those few won't have the courage to stand up to majority opinion underwritten by the authority of state. When they are weighing up what someone has achieved, and this is particularly true with rulers who can't be held to account, people look at the end result. So if a leader does what it takes to win power and keep it, his methods will always be reckoned honorable and widely praised. The crowd is won over by appearances and final results, and the world is all crowd. E nel mondo non è se non volgo. So it's true. Somebody will be ready to justify the prince and absolve him from his sins, from the means that he has used. Who? Il volgo, the crowd, the masses, the people. The masses, hypnotized by the victorious image of the prince, will never dare to call into question the means that he has used to conquer his successes. The masses, though. Il volgo. How cold that word, how full of ironic disdain. It's the general stupidity of the people which is responsible of the absolution of the prince from his vicious means, not Machiavelli himself. How bitter, and I would say how contemporary. The heart of darkness of the prince ends with a sort of chilling prophecy. Communities, peoples, democracies, ready to excuse anything done by their leaders, overwhelmed and corrupted by their malignant charisma. I have finished, but you can continue this discourse yourselves, filling the prophetic ending of this chapter of Machiavelli's Prince with names of your choice. Yeah.
Grazie, Riccardo. Thank you for this presentation. Do you have any question? I think I can start with the first. And my question is the following. You have said that The Prince is probably the best cover letter ever. Lettera di raccomandazione. So he wrote to be hired again by the Medici family. What kind of relationship Machiavelli had with the Medici, and why? And what kind of Medici was he thinking about as a potential leader of the community?
When Machiavelli got his office at the Second Chancery, he was 29. And we know very little about his youth. No, probably he stayed away from parties, and probably this is why and how he got that position. He was not politically compromised, either with the followers of Savonarola or the followers of the Medici. There is some very slim evidence that he had something to do with some members of the family, of the Medici family, but more on a literary basis than on a political basis. When the Medici came back, he had in mind to offer the prince. Have you been at the Cappella dei Principi in San Lorenzo, by Michelangelo? You have there the two people that Machiavelli had in mind as addressees of the prince. First, he wanted to dedicate him to Giuliano, Duca di Nemours, but then he thought of, and he didn't do it. But in the letter that he wrote to his friend announcing the composition of the prince, he says that he would like to offer the book to Giuliano, and then instead to Lorenzo Duca d'Urbino, not to be confused with Lorenzo il Magnifico. And Lorenzo Duca di Urbino, in time, who's the father, by the way, of Catherine de' Medici, the Queen of France, who became with Lorenzo Duca d'Urbino kind of built up in Florence a reputation that he might be a regular former prince of Florence. So this is but the person that Machiavelli had in mind. Lorenzo died young, and so that project kind of evaporated. But it's interesting that Guicciardini, who was another eminent political figure in Machiavelli's time, said that the Medici, when they came back in 1513, were wrong. Were wrong because they came back to Florence and they didn't have the courage of grabbing the formal power in town with violence or with some sort of coup d'etat. They came back trying to be what the Medici had traditionally been, had been the Principato Occulto, no? The rulers of the city without appearing to be the rulers of town. But there was this kind of growing sentiment that the Republican Florence might end in a principality, and Lorenzo was, as long as he lived, a good candidate. And when Lorenzo died, nothing happened, and the Florence became instead a republic after the sack of Rome under more dramatic circumstances. But it's very interesting how in Florence the destiny of this city is determined also by the accidents, by the events of a family, according to what is there, who survives, who dies, who comes back, who becomes the Pope. It's a very touchy relationship of this family with the city of Florence. And Machiavelli in those days thought that Lorenzo might be a good candidate, but a good candidate to what? Not just to the let's say to the lordship, to become the prince in Florence, but to become a leader capable of unifying, he says, Italy. And probably when when Machiavelli says Italy, he doesn't think of Sicily necessarily, but at least a big, a strong, big United States at the north center of the peninsula, and he thinks, and probably he was right, that was possible in that very moment, 1513. Why? Because the Pope was Leo X, who was a member of the Medici family. The idea of Machiavelli, and not a wrong idea, is that the Pope and the presence of the Pope in Rome always had been an obstacle to the unification of the country. But in that particular year, in that particular phase of Italian history, there was this magnificent coincidence that the interest of the Medici coincided with the interest of the Pope. So the Pope himself could have been interested for once, not in being an obstacle to the unification of Italy, but to be a kind of a patron of this unification, because it was in the interest in that moment of his own family.
Grazie. So I have two questions. The first as a reader of Machiavelli, and the second as somebody who teaches from time to time Machiavelli. And so the first as a reader, in chapter 17, if I remember, there is that thing about cruelty, and then fear and love, be feared or loved. And in that case, I was very, I love the idea of the disappearance of compassion. But in the case of fear and love, he kind of makes also a sort of jump, because he says, well, the question is not fear and love, it's to avoid hatred. Yeah. And they introduce another element there. And in that section of that chapter, there is some of the, let's say, things for which Machiavelli is considered, let's say, old Nick, as the English said, old Nick in the sense of the devil, which takes the name of Machiavelli. And that is the passage where he says, well, because people will sooner forgive you for killing the father than to take their property.
Yeah.
And so I want to know what you think about that passage or that piece and this third element of hatred inside your analysis. And my second question is, as an instructor that teaches Machiavelli from now and then, let's say, there is another anti-Machiavellism that I have in class, and it's the criticism that, let's say, about his misogyny. I know I'm taking you off track, but where students would criticize strongly Machiavelli for the Mandragora or Belfago for the misogynist stance he takes, and I wanted to know if you have anything to say about that.
Okay. For the first one, yes, the chapter 17 is a multi-layered chapter, because it starts with the opposition of cruelty and compassion, let's say, some clemency. Then to be feared or to be loved. And then if you are not loved and not feared, at least try not to be hated. So it's really a multi-layered. But the conclusion is what you were saying. I mean, at least try not to be hatred. And you are not hatred if you don't touch two things of your subjects in their private lives: patrimony and women. Which is curious, because this comes from Aristotle's Politics, but in a more, let's say, sexually tolerant world like Greece, Aristotle says to abstain from the youth, not necessarily just from women, from men and women of your interest, and yes, he says don't touch the patrimony, don't touch the money, don't touch the women, and if you don't invade these private spheres of your subject, you might avoid the. What must be said also is that this is the Prince, but Machiavelli did not write only the Prince. He wrote Discorsi, he wrote other political things, and in other circumstances of his writings, he appreciates instead traditionally the love of your subject as a bastion and a defense of your power. But here he goes to the extreme of saying that no, if you have to choose, it's better to be feared than loved. And he enters that in my opinion, very perilous ground, which is the literature about not the princes, but about tyrants, which is a very dangerous thing to touch. About his misogyny, about, well, it depends. They certainly Machiavelli had it seems a very can I say vivacious sexual life. This is clear from his letters. But I have to say also that naturally he also writes about sex according to the even literary genres of his time, the way we do, because we are not nature, we are culture. So even though sometimes we think that, oh, we are following the impulse of our nature, no, we are finding the impulse of our nature according to the standards or the counter standards of our culture. So many times he depicts it. There's a famous but exhilarating letter which you won't read to your students. The famous letter from Verona about his encounter with a prostitute in Verona. And it's a kind of disgusting letter, because this prostitute that he has sex with in the dark, once that he lights up the light, reveals herself being a horrible old woman. But even in that case, naturally, this is not just his sexual life. He is here writing a piece of a very well-established type of literature, what we call in Italian la letteratura comico-grottesca. We'll never know if that prostitute, first of all, if that prostitute existed, and we'll never know if that prostitute was really so repulsive. But he's writing according to the convenzioni of a certain literature. About the Mandragola, I don't see how Mandragola can be read as a misogynist text, because the real hero of the Mandragola, the hero in the sense that the victorious character of the Mandragola at the end is Lucrezia. Lucrezia has been duped and has been corrupted against her will. But in the end, it's Lucrezia who says, quello che mio marito ha voluto per una notte, io lo voglio per sempre. What happened to me tonight, and what my husband permitted that happened to me tonight, I want this forever. And she becomes, I mean, has been noticed that she starts using the imperative. Vai, fai, tornerai, farai. She is now really the prince of the plot. She is the one who inherit in the at the end of the comedy the function that has been of Ligurio all throughout the. Now she's in charge. Now she is in charge, and you have also the impression that even Callimaco, who the lover, who has if he doesn't have sex with Lucrezia, he will die, etc. At this point, he has become, I'm not saying the boy toy of Lucrezia, but she is the one who makes the rules of their relationship from now on. So I'd say that it is instead, especially compared to many other texts of the Renaissance, is a text where the figure of the woman at the end opens her eyes on the reality and all the lies that she has lived through, and especially the lies of his confessor, because that is the major realization in Lucrezia's life, because probably she knew that her husband was stupid, and she knew that her mother was, but she had the complete faith and confidence in her confessor. And now also her faith in religion has fallen, and she's there, and She's there among all these destroyed values around her, but she is the one who takes over